Welcome to Executive Insights for Life Sciences Innovators, and thanks for joining us. On this podcast, we'll explore leadership, innovation, and growth in the life sciences sector. I'm Don Alexander, founder of GeneCoda, a boutique executive search firm dedicated to connecting visionary leaders with life sciences companies shaping the future of therapeutics and scientific tools. On each episode, we'll dive into candid conversations with industry pioneers, uncovering strategies, insights, and real world experiences that drive success in our industry. If you're interested in presenting as a guest of a future episode, please scan the barcode image at the top of my video frame and follow the instructions. Now I'm pleased to be joined by Chris Hoyt, the CEO of KeifeRx. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Don. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Glad to host you today. KeifeRx is a clinical stage biotech, preclinical stage, excuse me, biotech developing small molecule therapies for neurodegenerative diseases based on technology licensed from Georgetown University. Chris is an entrepreneurial executive who has spent his career launching, funding, and scaling venture-backed companies across software, healthcare, and technology services. Over the course of his career, he's raised more than $400 million in debt and equity and completed more than 24 acquisitions and divestitures, totaling over $2 billion. Before joining KeifeRx, he was co-founder and CFO of Upskill, an enterprise wearable technology platform that raised over $65 million in venture capital before being acquired by TeamViewer. So, impressive background, Chris. Let's talk more about you and KeifeRx.
Sure.
First and foremost, your career journey and leadership philosophy. Your background, Chris, of course, is in building and financing venture-backed companies across multiple industries. What drew you into biotechnology, and what were the biggest adjustments when you began leading a deeply scientific organization like KeifeRx?
Sure. No, and it wasn't really a specific journey that or intent to get into biotech. I had an opportunity to invest in KeifeRx. I knew some of the founders of the company back in 2020. And at the time, as you mentioned, we were exiting a company called Upskill that I had started with some partners of mine, and just looked at first at Kiefer as a really interesting opportunity to take a different approach to treating neurodegenerative disease. The company was founded using the idea of using kinase inhibitors as a way to essentially trigger autophagy, remove toxic proteins, reduce inflammation, and improve vascular health. And I just got really interested, and I spent a bunch of time with the team in the summer of 2020, helping them think about financing strategy. And towards the end of that year, they asked me if I would be willing to join as the CEO. And the idea then was the markets were still very strong. It was the end of 2020. We'd spend, 12, 18 months, raise a bunch of capital, and then bring in an industry CEO, and I'd step to the board or some other role. And so thought, okay, let's do this. Now the world changed pretty quickly after I started as CEO. And, we did raise some capital, but decided that it made more sense to really just sort of dig in. Now I will say that the biggest change for me was just the level of all the industries I've been in have had technical components to them, but in software and the like, but none so where it's so important as it is in biotech. I mean, biotech is very binary. It's either the science works or it doesn't. And so I had to really do a deep dive to try to get to understand the underlying science of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and I would tell you 5 years into this, I think I have a pretty good grasp of it, but I'll never understand it as well as, for instance, my scientific co-founders and others in the field. So that's been the biggest challenge.
Yeah, certainly learning the concepts, the vocabulary, and everything that's associated
Sure.
can be quite daunting. I guess a follow on there, how do you think about leading highly technical teams there at KeifeRx while maintaining the commercial discipline that you kind of bring to the company?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's something I've learned over time. But I mean, I think the first thing is you have to have respect for each other, right? So I have tremendous respect for my scientific co-founder, Dr. Musa, my other co-founder, Dr. Pagan, who's the vice chair of neurology at Georgetown University Medical Center. and the people that I work with, and they have respect for me, which means, you can just ask the questions, right? Like I can't pretend that I know everything. So I have to be open to just asking probing questions, and they have to be open to giving me good feedback. And, and we've got that kind of relationship. So that's sort of a key thing. I would say the other piece is that, the highly technical folks, I mean, they do want these sort of constraints, these commercial constraints, so that they know what everybody needs to know what we need to focus on. Because as a researcher, it's easy to get sort of lost down various, various alleyways and the like. And so it's my job to basically say, hey, this is what we're focused on. This is what we need to accomplish. Help me understand the best way to get that done. But I think that sort of trust and respect are the key components.
Indeed, absolutely. That's great. What just and I know you came into KeifeRx as an investor as well. What separates in your mind, Chris, interesting science from investable science?
Yeah, and I think this is again something that I had to learn over time. But look, I think it's first you have to have, sort of that good preclinical or clinical proof of concept data, right? Because it all does come back to the science. And one of the things that differentiates Key4X is we do have uh, human proof of concept data through a drug called nilotinib that we have the license to for neurodegenerative disease. And, we've had numerous small phase 2 trials run at Georgetown using nilotinib in Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementia, and Huntington's disease. And, that proof of concept helps us understand that this mechanism can have a positive impact in these diseases. The second thing is clear regulatory pathway. I mean, you've got to know how you're going to get your drug through the FDA process. In our world, that's pretty straightforward because the FDA does have a clear set of endpoints that they look for in dementia trials. And then third, of course, is just you've got to have a market that you can address that's large enough to justify the investment you're making. And again, neurodegeneration is probably the largest unmet medical need, out there today. And, these are big markets. There's 55 million people worldwide with dementia today. And that number will be closer to 140 million by 2050, just as we age and get sort of better ways of finding folks that have these diseases. So you really need all three of those components, and they're equally important.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking earlier about the demographics and how that's shifting towards a more geriatric population that
Mhm.
yeah tends to have these kinds of disease sets. So thank you for the work that you're doing. In terms of the company itself, KeifeRx, and obviously it's operating in an innovation landscape. And small molecules, tell me a little bit about that. So, what makes small molecules still highly relevant in today's therapeutic landscape, do you think?
Yeah, I'd say one thing from a general perspective, and then another specific to our space. But I mean, generally, we're still in a world where 90% of all marketed drugs are small molecules, right? I'm not going away. This is, uh, for some diseases, it's the best way to get to targets. It's still the least expensive way to manufacture a drug. So, small molecules, we don't get as much of the I don't know, sort of the press or the excitement as compared to things like genetic medicines and biologics, but the world still runs on small molecules. Now, I'd say for brain related diseases, it's even more important because larger molecules can't get past the blood brain barrier. So what you end up with is you have to find ways around that, like with these AAV shuttle transports and the like. And so you're finding more complicated ways to try to get a drug into the brain. But a small molecule designed correctly can get through the blood-brain barrier, and we've shown that with our both with nilotinib and our preclinical drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. How does structure-based design, rational chemistry, meaningfully improve the probability of success?
Yeah, and it's an interesting question because in our case, we started from, or Dr. Musa started from a position of looking at existing leukemia drugs, and his father had passed away from leukemia. He was really interested in trying to understand whether drugs that could shrink tumors in the body and cancer could also enter the brain and essentially trigger autophagy and remove toxic proteins, because his career had been focused on looking at neurodegenerative disease. And so he found that at lower doses, you could get these drugs into the brain, which was somewhat unexpected, frankly. And so we started from that structure of already having essentially a molecule that we knew could get into the brain and have a positive impact on cognition. And so from there, we essentially went through a process of, taking the portion of nilotinib that got in the brain, isolate that, and create a set of preclinical drugs that essentially get in the brain much more effectively. So nilotinib is about 1% of it gets into the brain. Our preclinical drugs, including our lead asset, KeifeRx3, is roughly 35% brain penetrant. So we're getting much better penetration into the brain. That allows us to get better dosing. And so we kind of, we didn't follow that sort of traditional rational chemistry approach, right? We started from a known molecule and then really went to work trying to get to an optimized brain penetrant drug. And, and we also looked at it from the perspective that we knew that we needed to do more than just remove toxic proteins, right? So if you think about something like Alzheimer's, you've got amyloid beta and tau as the sort of two proteins you're most worried about. And, we've seen that reducing those proteins by themselves is not enough. And so we wanted a drug that was specifically designed to inhibit multiple kinases that would remove those proteins, but also have a positive impact on neuroinflammation and vascular health. Because again, we believe that you need to address all of these components in order to show improvements in cognition.
Excellent. Yeah, it's kind of a multi-pronged approach there.
Yep.
That's great. In a general sense, and I know you probably work with other biotech companies or know of them, but I'm kind of curious, where do you see the biggest disconnect these days between the hype and reality in biotech innovation right now?
Yeah, and I think some of this is changing a little bit right now, but for a while, we were definitely in a world where it's like, if you couldn't answer the how did AI impact your drug development strategy, you couldn't get people's attention. And, and so that was sort of very, it could be very frustrating. Look, I think AI is going to be sort of, and has been very important in drug discovery, but we have our drugs discovered. We know what our molecules are. We've optimized them. We're not at that stage of development. So, this sort of focus on AI everywhere has been a little bit of a challenge. Now, I do think this idea of how do we shrink the time from discovery to a marketed drug is important, and is something AI is going to be helpful with, particularly around clinical trial design and patient selection. But I just think, the hype and the focus around AI from a drug development perspective has been a bit overblown. You really haven't seen drugs hit the clinic yet that have come out of that process. Now, again, that's going to change over time, right? And if we were starting from day zero, we would certainly be using AI in drug discovery. But I just got tired of hearing about AI and the like. So that would probably be it for me.
Yeah, yeah, you've got to be an AI company these days, that's for sure, it seems.
Right.
Talk to me a little bit well, let's turn to, I guess, the scaling, funding, and business strategy
Sure.
components. Chris, what were the earliest strategic decisions at KeifeRx that mattered the most, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I mean, we've been at it for 5 years. We've had to adjust our strategy a few times just based on sort of capital availability and what was happening in the marketplace. And one big decision we had to make, our platform of kinase inhibitors could be used in things other than neurodegeneration, right? So each of our preclinical drugs inhibits a protein called c-Kit, and c-Kit mediates mast cell growth. And so mast cells are implicated in things like urticaria and hives and other peripheral nervous system diseases. And we definitely had a few investors say, like, why don't you just focus there? It's so much easier than trying to deal with, things that impact the brain. And so one key decision we had to make was to say, look, we based on our DNA and our desire to have an impact on the world, want to maintain a focus on neurodegenerative disease. So that was a big decision, right? That meant that there were entire sections of our portfolio that we would not progress, either on our own or maybe in the future with partners, but we had to make that decision, and that was a big one. But I would say that's probably the most important. I mean, the other thing we've done is just really tried to focus on work coming out of Georgetown. Dr. Musa has been continuing to develop new drugs that we think could be impactful in neurodegeneration. And so we have a good pipeline coming from his work. And so we didn't need to go try to find, other programs. So those two decisions, I think, to sort of focus both in neuro and maintain our focus on the pipeline coming out of Georgetown were two significant ones.
Two big ones,
Yep.
absolutely. Yeah, and in terms of the investment climate and how you allocate, limited capital ultimately
Sure.
across discovery, validation, preclinical advancement, how
Yep.
do you think about those aspects?
Well, I think in two different dimensions. So that first question around focus between discovery, validation, and preclinical work. What we've done is we've sponsored Dr. Musa's lab at Georgetown as a way to have sort of exposure to additional discovery and validation. But we are not sort of out actively sort of investing in that part of the cycle. Like I said, we have four preclinical drugs. We have a clinical program using nilotinib in a new novel formulation. And so, you know, what my challenge is more, how do I allocate resources across those programs?
Hmm.
Uh, as a relatively young biotech, we can't we can't fund five programs, right? So we had to make a decision to say, okay, look, we're going to have one internal program that is our lead asset, which is KeifeRx 3 in Alzheimer's. And then for the other programs, we're going to try to find partners. So,
Yeah.
we were lucky enough to find a partnership with Amneal Pharmaceuticals for a drug KeifeRx 6, which is a LRRK2 inhibitor in Parkinson's, and they're helping us work through the remaining preclinical testing that we need to do for that program. And then we would look to sort of partner into a human trial with Amneal. Similarly, for nilotinib, where we have a new formulation, we believe we could actually get into a late stage clinical trial for nilotinib based on data that came out of a trial for Lewy body disease. And so we're moving from an oral formulation to a transdermal. But again, we need to partner with somebody for that program. It's going to be a significant cost to get a pivotal clinical trial done. And so we're looking at partnering as the sort of best way to allocate resources. And then, like I said, we'll continue to move KeifeRx 3 along using our own resources because we think that's probably the largest upside program.
Gotcha. So a combination of moving lead asset internally in the company and then other assets vis-a-vis partnerships. Yeah,
Absolutely.
supermodel. Yeah, because it definitely gets very expensive to try to contend with all of that
Yes.
as a smaller biotech company. So,
Mhm.
um, so and let me ask you this also about the portfolio. How do you balance speed with de-risking?
Yeah, it's actually one of the more interesting things that I've learned in this industry compared to the others I've been in. And I think universally speed matters when you're building a startup. But in a world where, your market opportunity is limited by your patent life, speed becomes that much more important in biotech compared to other industries. And, so this question becomes like, you have to balance how much time you spend early versus how much time you're going to spend later. And it's a hard balancing act because you may look to do so. For instance, right now we're in a world where when you do a phase 1 trial, you almost universally now have to do a 1B trial in order to get some human signals, right? Where you're doing the trial in patients. And doing that extends the timeline. Like you're adding a whole set of things that are quote unquote not required from the FDA. But if you don't do it, you don't raise capital, right? So you have to sort of balance trying to go fast where you can, but also understanding that there are steps that you just can't skip, because if you do, you're going to find yourself in a world of hurt when either you can't raise capital or later the FDA says, hey, you only did a 13-week long-term tox trial instead of 6 months, and now we need a 6 month trial, right? So things like that, you just have to figure out the balancing act.
Absolutely. That's great. In terms of the vision for the future, what does success, Chris, look like for KeifeRx 5 years from now?
Yeah, I think success would be having a handful of drugs in human clinical trials. I mean, we would like to have 5 years out, have nilotinib transdermal, approved so that we can treat patients with Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's disease dementia. That would be sort of a huge win. I'd also love to see a world where, Kiefer X3 is in a sort of mid-stage, potentially late-stage clinical trial in Alzheimer's. Everybody that goes into this business essentially wants to see patients get drugs, right? That is, get drugs that don't just treat symptoms, that can actually slow down cognitive decline in these diseases. And man, if we could do that, that would be incredible.
Absolutely. Be doing society a favor for sure. How do you build an organization that attracts top scientific talent without bloating overhead?
Ooh, yeah, so that's a great question. And, because of the capital environment we've been in, we have actually kept our company like very lean, right? So, we basically have two, well, 1.5 full-time employees, myself being the one. We have an advisory board that's sort of world-class, scientific advisory board. I keep my co-founders essentially are advisors and consultants of the company. So we've had to be really lean, but we will have to build out the team. And I think you do that, partially on the strength of the science, right? Because the people that come into these companies want to know that you have something different and something that can potentially reach the clinic and then reach patients. So I think that sort of viability is a key component. But you also have to have an environment where people can come in and exercise their expertise, right? Like we're not if we hire when we hire head of clinical affairs or head of corporate development, like they are all going to have to run with their part of our organization because I can't sit here and tell them here are the 10 things that you have to do your job, right? I need to just sort of help manage the priorities, but give people the opportunity to really sort of do their thing.
Absolutely. Oh, that's great. Now, where do you see the most compelling opportunities in small molecule therapeutics over the next decade?
Well, I mean, for us, we've made our bet, right? And that is that CNS indications will be, one of the strongest areas for small molecule development. It's not to say that we won't continue to have, antibody development, that we won't see biologics and genetic medicines having an impact in our field, because I think we certainly will. But I think it's a great area for small molecules, and it's also sort of just a known patients are used to taking pills, right? It's just you have less education requirement and compliance requirements. So I do think there's strong opportunities there.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. So, what structural changes do you think, Chris, the biotech ecosystem needs to become more sustainable over the next decade?
Yeah, I think we do have to sort of get a better match between the timeline associated with drug development and the timeline associated with the financing sources that are available to us. So specifically, venture funds got a 5 to 10 year life cycle. They've got to invest that fund in the first couple of years, and then really they've got to be done investing it 5, 6 years into it. And so, when you have a drug that's going to take 15 years to get to market, you just you're not going to have capital that can sort of see that whole journey through. Now, it's not entirely the case. I mean, some of the larger funds, of course, can invest early and then continue to invest throughout that life cycle. But there are a handful of really large funds in this space. So I think having a better match between duration of sort of capital need and duration of financing sources is one. Look, I think it'd be great if we back in a world where you had more consistent access to the public markets. We this industry more than any I've ever seen is sort of a little bit crazy in the way the public markets work, where you have periods where just about anything can go public, regardless of how much data they have, and then you have periods where almost nobody can go public. And I'm not suggesting that a company like Kiefer X is ready for public listing today. I mean, we're not, but but at least it provides an outlet for that money that's got a 5 to 7 year life cycle can find, a reasonable exit. So today, what's happened is if you're a earlier stage biotech, you've got to assume that you're going to have to sell the business after your phase 1 trial, because that's maybe not after necessarily always after your stage 1, but you're going to have to sell the business because that's the way you're going to get an exit for your capital, and that's the way you're going to essentially continue to develop the programs. So more options as the guy who needs money, more options for money would be my answer.
More optionality, that works.
Yes.
There are a number of different entrepreneurs, founders, operators, Chris, that listen to our show. I'm grateful to say. In that spirit, what thoughts or advice would you like to share with our audience? Perhaps something that would be actionable for them.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll give sort of one practical answer and one more I don't know, theoretical for lack of a better word. So I think one piece of advice I'd give is just you just have to be persistent. Like, this is a market that's almost designed to to make you give up, right? I mean, it's just there's a lot of roadblocks you're going to run into, and you just gotta keep going. Um, but I'd say from like a practical perspective, the other thing I see is, and I saw this in software as well, but you end up in a world where people raise capital and then they feel the need to immediately ramp up their expenses, whether that's headcount or lab space or equipment or whatever. And I would just say, like, don't need to rush right out and grow your team, because one, in our space there are so many ways to get expertise into your business through consultants, advisors, and others, that you don't need to build that very costly infrastructure, because it's hard to reverse it later. I mean, I've been through that where we've had to go through layoffs, and not here in biotech, but elsewhere, and it's just really painful. So be thoughtful about how you build up that cost structure.
Absolutely. Great. How can listeners connect with you, Chris, and learn more about KeifeRx's work?
Well, we're on the web, of course. We've got www.KeifeRx.com is the website. We have a pretty active LinkedIn presence. We're actually trying to sort of bolster that a bit more. And of course, I'm also on LinkedIn personally. And yeah, welcome any outreach. Love talking to people in our industry, whether they're operators, funders, and even people that are just trying to get in. I coming out of Georgetown, we get a lot of students who are interested in this field, and so I do spend some time, helping and mentoring folks that are trying to understand how to get into the industry, and I do find that through very, yeah, very satisfying.
That's great. Passing it on to the next generation.
For
So
sure.
that's good. So that wraps up this episode of Executive Insights for Life Sciences Innovators. I appreciate you tuning in. I hope you found today's conversation valuable. If you enjoyed the discussion, please be sure to leave a review and share it with your network. Please also mark your calendars for March 23rd at 1 o'clock with Chris Gropp, our second Chris, the CEO of Trialogics. Thanks for listening.